You know, October 1962. For 13 days, the entire world was just frozen, staring into the abyss of nuclear war. We call it the Cuban Missile Crisis. And we all think we know the story, right? A brave American president stands firm, doesn't blink, and forces the Soviets to back down, single-handedly saving the world. But what if that story isn't the real story? What if what actually happened is way more complex and, frankly, a lot more incredible?
So that brings us to the big question we're going to tackle in this explainer. Did JFK really save the world all by himself? The popular history, the one you see in movies, says absolutely yes. But the truth? Well, it's a lot messier. And believe it or not, the story doesn't even begin in Cuba.
To really get what happened, you have to rewind the clock a bit. Because this whole crisis, it wasn't sparked by Soviet missiles showing up in Cuba out of the blue. No, it was kicked off by a chain of American actions that were, let's just say, highly provocative.
Okay, picture this. It's late 1961, and the United States places 15 Jupiter missiles in Turkey. Now, these aren't just any missiles. They're carrying nuclear warheads, each one over 100 times more powerful than the bomb that hit Hiroshima. And here's the kicker. From Turkey, they could hit Moscow in 10 minutes. 10 minutes. That's not a warning, that's a death sentence. For the Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, this was an existential threat, right on his back porch.
Now, as if that wasn't enough, just look at this chart. The nuclear imbalance in 1962 was absolutely staggering. The US had more than 24,000 nuclear weapons. The Soviets, barely 2,500. This wasn't a fair fight. It wasn't even close. Khrushchev knew he was in a really tight spot, strategically speaking. He was completely outgunned and looking for some way to level the playing field.
At the very same time, the Kennedy administration was running what was basically a secret war against Fidel Castro's Cuba. And I'm not talking about harsh language at the UN. I mean, we had the bungled Bay of Pigs invasion, then there was Operation Mongoose, a massive $50 million CIA operation to cause chaos in Cuba. There were even multiple and kind of bizarre plots to assassinate Castro. We're talking everything from exploding seashells to poisoned cigars. They were even drawing up plans to stage fake attacks on American soil just to create a pretext to invade.
So if you're Khrushchev, you've got American nukes on your border, and your main ally in the Western Hemisphere is under constant attack. What do? Well, he came up with a pretty vivid solution. He famously said to his defense minister, "Why not put a porcupine in America's pants?" That porcupine, of course, was Soviet nuclear missiles. And America's pants? Cuba. It was an incredibly gutsy move, designed to do two things at once: protect his ally and show the US what it feels like to have nuclear missiles right next door.
And with that one decision, the fuse was lit. The world was now hurtling towards a nuclear showdown. And for the next 13 days, every single person on the planet held their breath while the two most powerful nations on Earth played a terrifying game of nuclear chicken.
Now, the Soviets tried to sneak these missiles in, but CIA Director John McCone had a gut feeling this was happening way back in July of '62. Problem was, nobody really listened to him. It took until October 14th when a U-2 spy plane flying high over Cuba snapped these undeniable photos for reality to set in. 2 days later, President Kennedy saw the pictures, and on October 22nd, he went on live television and told a terrified world that we were on the brink.
And let's be crystal clear, this was not a drill. The US military went to DEFCON 2. That is the step right before nuclear war breaks out. It's the highest state of alert our forces have ever been in. B-52 bombers armed with nuclear weapons were in the air 24/7. Submarines were moving into position. The entire planet was a hair trigger away from annihilation.
But you know, the moment we came closest to the end wasn't in the White House. It wasn't in the Kremlin. It was happening in total isolation, deep under the surface of the Atlantic Ocean, on a single Soviet submarine called the B-59. And this is a part of the story that was kept secret for decades.
So get this, US warships were dropping small, non-lethal depth charges near the B-59. To them, it was just a signal to get the sub to come up. But down below, the sub's crew had been out of contact with Moscow for weeks. They were hot, exhausted, and they thought the depth charges meant World War III had started. So the submarine's captain ordered them to fire their nuclear torpedo. Launching it needed a green light from 3 senior officers. 2 of them said yes, but the third, a man named Vasily Arkhipov, said no. He refused. That one man with that one word almost certainly prevented a nuclear war.
Okay, so while the whole world is bracing for nuclear Armageddon, a completely different drama is playing out behind the scenes. And the path away from the brink wasn't some heroic American victory. It was a secret deal, a quiet compromise that saved everyone.
Kennedy's team was in a bind because they were getting two different messages from Khrushchev. The first was a rambling, emotional, private letter saying, hey, we'll pull the missiles out if you just promise not to invade Cuba. But then, a second, much tougher message came over public radio, adding a new condition. The U.S. also had to remove its missiles from Turkey. So which deal was the real one? It caused total chaos inside the White House.
And this table right here, this lays out what actually happened. The public deal, the one everyone heard about, is on the left. Soviets pull their missiles out of Cuba, and the U.S. promises to leave Cuba alone. Simple. But then there's the secret agreement on the right. The U.S. would quietly remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey. See, it wasn't a surrender, it was a trade, a quid pro quo.
So how'd they make this secret deal? Well, the president sent his own brother, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, to meet with the Soviet ambassador in secret. RFK gave his word that the missiles in Turkey would be gone in a few months, but he was absolutely insistent that this part of the deal had to stay secret. They couldn't look like they'd given in, not to their allies or to the American public.
So, the crisis was averted, but the secret deal meant the story, the official story, was going to be very different from the reality, and that myth of a tough American triumph would stick around for decades.
And look at the fallout for the two leaders. It's a tale of two completely different fates. JFK was celebrated around the world. He became this legendary hero who stared down the Russians and won. Khrushchev, on the other hand, was seen as weak, as having been humiliated, and that perception was a huge reason he was kicked out of power 2 years later, even though, ironically, he'd actually gotten everything he wanted.
So, let's just quickly recap the real story here. The crisis was a reaction to American provocation. The solution wasn't a U.S. victory, it was a secret trade. Khrushchev, the guy who lost, actually succeeded in protecting Cuba and getting U.S. missiles off his border. And the wildest part? The full truth about this secret deal didn't come out until 1987, 25 years later.
In the end, what saved the world wasn't a show of force or one leader forcing another to back down. It was a secret compromise. It was good old-fashioned diplomacy that pulled us all back from the edge. So that leaves us with a pretty big question, doesn't it? When we look at the massive crises facing us today, what should we be aiming for? A public victory that looks good, or a quiet solution that actually works?